Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thanks, everyone, for coming to this, our final shop talk, at least in this room of this fellowship year. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Peter Miller, the arts director at the Academy, and tonight it's my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Cody, the American Academy in Rome Prize, or the recipient of the American Academy in Rome Prize in Historic Preservation and Conservation. Jeff received his PhD in the history of architecture and urban development in the Department of City and Regional Planning at Cornell University in 1989. And he studied early modern European history at Amherst College, where he graduated cum laude in 1972. Jeff has been Senior Project Specialist at the Getty Conservation Institute in Los Angeles since 2004, when he began coordinating a series of ongoing educational, architectural, and urban conservation training activities, mainly for Southeast Asian conservation professionals. He has also coordinated training courses and workshops of varying lengths and areas of focus for the mayors of World Heritage Cities, Tunisian archaeologists, East Asian heritage site managers, and others, which has taken him to historic landscapes from Angkor in Cambodia and Hiroshima in Japan to Cusco, Peru, and Kazan in Russia. His important work concerns both the fragile historical and architectural heritage in rapidly changing parts of the world, particularly China, transformed daily by breakneck economic development, and at the same time the attempts to create meaningful international cultural dialogue and long-term strategies necessary to preserve that fragile heritage. His interests are wide-ranging and comprise many different media, not only architecture and urban planning. At the Getty, he's also collaborated with the curator of photography at the Getty Research Institute and co-curating an exhibition about early photography in China, which opened in February 2011 at the Getty Museum. From 1995 to 2004, Jeff was a professor of architectural history in the School of Architecture at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he specialized in research about late Qing and Republican China, that is late 19th and 20th century Chinese architecture and urbanism. In Hong Kong, he was also appointed to the Antiquities Advisory Board of the Hong Kong government, a position he held from 2001 to 2004. Jeff is the author of numerous articles and two important books. The first, Building in China, Henry Murphy's Adaptive Architecture, published in 2001 by the University of Washington Press. And the second, Exporting American Architecture 1870 to 2000, which was published by Routledge in 2003. He's the co-editor of two others, Chinese Architecture and the Beaux-Arts from 2011, which was based on a conference he co-organized at the University of Pennsylvania with faculty from Penn School of Architecture. And another book that he co-edited, Brush and Shutter, Early Photography in China. That was the photography, the catalog accompanying the exhibition I just mentioned. From 1989 to 1994, Jeff taught in Cornell's City and Regional Planning Department, and 3 of those years in Cornell's History Department. He also directed Cornell's year abroad program in Paris during the 1994-95 year, and the list continues. He's also worked with French archaeologists for several years in Burgundy and in the Forez region near Saint-Étienne, excavating abandoned medieval villages. At the Getty Conservation Institute, in addition to coordinating urban conservation and training projects, Jeff is also completing a book manuscript, a reading anthology for architects and planners, co-edited with an Italian conservation architect, Francesco Siravo, that the Getty will publish in its Readings in Conservation series entitled Historic Cities, Issues in Urban Conservation. Tonight, Jeff will share his research that he's working on at the moment about Italian architect Saverio Muratori, which will serve as a kind of springboard for some personal reflections on the field of conservation and his lifelong interest in cultural history, archaeology, architecture, and urbanism. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Cody, whose talk is entitled Mappa Mundi, From Mappa Mundi to Muratori, A Journey into Conservation. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter, for that embarrassingly long but typical kind of introduction. And thank you to the American Academy in general, and to many of my friends and colleagues here. These past, I've counted them, 126 days that I've been here has given me many, many gifts, and I'm looking forward to the next 53 days that I'll be here. Actually, even though the title is A Journey into Conservation, tonight my presentation is really going to be framed by three journeys. Journey number one, the main one, is related to my project here, and it's going to be the longest in length, related to Saverio Muratori, an Italian architect's work related to urban morphology that did not take him directly into conservation, but which had conservation-related implications. Muratori was a practitioner, an urbanist, and an educator who developed theoretical ideas and practical examples about what he called typomorphology within the context of what he called applied history or Storia Operante. His work influenced other Italian architects who engaged in both design and urban conservation. Journey number two is related to Malaysia, where I've worked for the past 4 years, coordinating 3 short training courses for architects and planners that focused on the conservation of historic architecture and places within urban contexts. And a key question I've been asking myself while I'm here in Rome is whether and how I might connect Muratori's interests in systematically reading the city with training courses that I will help to create and coordinate, inshallah, in Southeast Asia in the future. Journey number 3 is related to the Latin couplet Mappa Mundi, or world map, in my title. And this concerns a transformative journey, a picaresque wandering pilgrimage, kind of quest, which I took 4 decades ago. The trip, as my 2 children, Maura and Aaron, sometimes refer to it, propelled me into the fields of architecture and conservation from earlier work in medieval history and early modern history and archaeology. And I've rarely talked about this journey publicly, although it's not a big secret. You can find out just by Googling me a little bit about it. But you're a perfect audience to hear about it, I think. So in the spirit of a process-focused shop talk, I'll share with you some aspects of my own personal journey into conservation. But first, journey number 1. This curious 20th century Italian architect fervently believed that the city was an organism. He wasn't the first to believe that, but that's one of the takeaways I'd like you to remember about him. One of the main questions that plagued Muratori was, as an architect, what's the best way to read and understand that organism? However, before answering that question, and before delving deeper into Muratori and what his approach to cities entailed, let me explain, I think I should explain, how and why I began to focus on him. Much of my own scholarship in the past 30 years, as you've heard just a bit of a CV resume, has been rooted in Asia, China and Hong Kong particularly. As a graduate student at Cornell in the mid-1980s, I became aware of an American architect, Henry Murphy, who began to work in China the year that the building we're now in was erected, 1914. And he practiced there consistently until 1935. I learned Mandarin so I could study Murphy's work, which led me to Shanghai during the academic year 1987-88. And it was through studying Murphy, my PhD topic, that I began to understand the rich, complex world of post-imperial and pre-communist China in particular, and China as a major global culture more generally. So the man and his work became a lens that allowed me to see a bigger picture. I was pulled into that picture even further when I began teaching architectural history in Hong Kong, approximately 20 years ago. Murphy was a prelude to my more recent investigations of Muratori, which began when I started collaborating with Francesco Siravo, as you just heard, an Italian architect now working for the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, who, like me, has witnessed the remarkable loss during our lifetimes, worldwide, of what is often called urban fabric, tessuto urbano. The loss of historic urban fabric certainly occurred well before we came on the scene. One could easily argue that cities have been obliterated for millennia. However, the pace of urban destruction worldwide today is unprecedented. This is especially true in East Asia, but dramatic architectural changes are occurring in cities globally, with troubling implications for the future. About 6 years ago, Francesco and I began editing this book that Peter just mentioned about the conservation of historic architecture in cities, a readings anthology with our own commentaries that the Getty will, my employer since 2004, by the way, will publish when we finally complete it, which I hope is really soon. And it was through Francesco and this book project that I began to learn more about the remarkable work of several Italian architects after World War II. Some I'd known about, like Aldo Rossi and Leonardo Benevolo, but some I'd never heard of. People like Giovanni Astengo and Saverio Muratori, as well as several of his followers and other Italian conservation activists. The more I learned about the efforts of these Italian architects to understand and protect Italian cities, the more intrigued I became. Hence was born my American Academy project to scrutinize Muratori more carefully, as I'd done with Murphy in China many years ago, probing one figure to provide an opening into a wider picture, to better understand the context in which he worked, and to determine how I might adapt lessons from this work in my own training projects in Asia. Italian architects, planners, and urbanists faced myriad challenges in rebuilding cities after the war. Among them, how to deal with severe housing needs and how to add new modern layers of change to the stratigraphic tapestry of so many urban places in this vast, alluring peninsula in the middle of the Mediterranean that has drawn all of us into its vortex. In that long sentence that I've just uttered lurks the tricky word modern, which leads us to Muratori, an architect from Modena, born in 1910, who came of age during fascism and did some curious work before the war, which I'm not going to be talking about tonight, and who began practicing more actively in the late 1940s, when he began to see the city, as he put it, as, quote, the field of action and of study, because the city is the maximum informative teacher, especially for today's problems. Some of those problems, he believed, were due to what he called a positivistic approach to building, where during the first half of the 20th century, so much of architectural and urban design theory ceased to be cultural devices deeply rooted in history. Instead, Murphy thought that planning and design had been reduced to technical devices. This came, he asserted, with the advent of modern architecture, exemplified by institutions such as the Bauhaus and later CIAM, or the Congress of Modern Architecture, whose proponents, such as Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, urged clean breaks from the past and a new path for both architectural design and urbanism. Muratori and several of his Italian contemporaries after the war remained unconvinced of that path. He criticized Corb's Ville radieuse because of how it assumed the complete substitution of existing fabric with new forms without, as he put it, any ligament to tradition. He also criticized what he called Anglo-Saxon currents, such as the decentralizing tendencies of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre city, because they dream, he said, of the integral dissolution of the city from the countryside. We could debate those phrases and whether he was right, but that's what he believed. However, several Italian architects, he included, were intrigued with other kinds of modern approaches to architecture and design, particularly in Holland and Scandinavia. But that's a story that I'm not really going to pursue now. in the interest of time. Muratori thus began articulating his own ideas about why the city was important. And he wrote, and I'm quoting him now, "Throughout its history, urbanism has always been a perennial and perpetually self-renewing architectural genesis. It is a manifestation of the individual and at the same time collective foundation of architectural creation. The essential fact of urbanism is the organism and character of the city. That is, the original sense of the development of its plan over time, of its co-location in the landscape, of its urban and building structures, its civic and social life, its moral climate, its traditions and history," unquote. He rallied against what he called the gravest errors in contemporary urbanistic activity, caused by both technicians and historians, who have dealt with cities as if they were inert objects, which may be subjected to drastic and unilateral transformations. Only recently did a better evaluation of the concept city lead to the beginning of a new comprehension, he said. Here, Muratori was implicitly referring to late 19th century theorists and practitioners such as Camillo Zitta in Austria and Patrick Geddes from Scotland, who also practiced in India, who urged a more biological, organic notion of city genesis and development. This in the wake of Charles Darwin's evolutionary and revolutionary ideas about humanity at large. The two key points here are, first, that Muratori's insistence on how the city was an organism connected to individuals' decisions about how and what to build, what we might call vernacular traditions in English, or what was called edilizia di base in Italian. And secondly, the importance he attached to linking that living urban organism with the broader physical landscape, what he and his contemporaries called territorio. I want to look at both these key points in turn, but first, briefly, I want to note another of Muratori's early critiques concerning the field I care so much about, architectural and urban conservation. Muratori criticized what he termed some erudite conservation approaches that seemed to advocate what he called a museum city. He had been inspired in some respects by Italian architects such as Gustavo Giovannoni, also an ardent follower of Zitta and Geddes, whose approaches to more careful urban surgery, encapsulated in theories about diradamento, or pruning, rather than sventramento, or vast clearing of urban fabric, were attractive to Muratori and others. In his critique of contemporary conservation in Italy, Muratori urged a more practical approach to conservation, one that was more integrated into the living body of the city and of the transforming society, with, as he put it, its ambiente, economy, and spiritual development. Conservation, he said, is not only historic contemplation, but it should be active and practical, taking on a responsibility not only for truth, but for life. As I've learned more about Muratori, I've been fascinated by these ideas, in part because they seem so relevant to so many challenges we continue to face regarding modernism, links to the past, and avoiding museum cities, as we, people like myself involved in urban conservation, as well as many non-experts, ordinary people making their ways in life, strive to find ways to keep historic cities alive and relevant as vibrant places for themselves and all members of society. Many of you in this room also relate to these endeavors, even if you don't consider yourselves involved in conservation per se. Okay, now that I've gotten that off my chest, let's return to those two key points related to Muratori. The city as organism and the link between the city and its territorio. Muratori was in his mid-30s, roughly the median age of American Academy in Rome fellows, by the way, striving to find a sensible path in design and urbanism during Italy's remarkable post-World War II cultural and physical reconstruction. In 1949, he began working for a fascinating social housing program, Ina Casa, a successor to an earlier housing initiative, the Istituto de Case Popolari, and Rome's master plan that had been put in effect in 1931 despite the end of fascism and the war, was not revised officially until 1959. And thus, when Inakaza began, a clear path to guide development through a plan was neither enacted nor enforced. The result was sporadic, uncontrolled, and sprawling growth. But they were reacting against this. During the program's first 7 years, from 1949 to 56, 500 new homes were constructed per week under this Inakaza program. By the time Inakaza was terminated in 1963, 350,000 units had been built in more than 5,000 Italian communities. Over 1/2 of Italian cities have at least one Inakaza project, and more than 1/3 of all Italian architects during the 49-63 period worked on at least one Inakaza project. Muratori was one of them. He began to forge a path that was neither distinctly modern in the Bauhaus sense, nor classical in the sense of using an antique architectural vocabulary. Instead, given how Mussolini had co-opted both these architectural tendencies in places like the Foro Italico and elsewhere, the Inakaza notion was to seek inspiration for new housing neighborhoods, in part from contemporary examples in Holland and Sweden, as well as from Italy's rich regional vernacular traditions. Thus, there were references, as you see here, to traditional construction materials and methods like tuffo stone and brick or sloped tiled roofs. As one scholar has said, quote, "The designs of Inakaza both reflected and constructed evolving ideas about Italian identity, modernity, and community after fascism," unquote. I visited the 3 major Inakaza projects on the outskirts of Rome that Muratori worked on, primarily with the architect Mario De Renzi. Tusculano II and Valco San Paolo in eastern Rome, and Stella Polare in Ostia. Here are some images from those projects to give you a sense of what he designed. I'm not going to go into great detail about this now. This is the Tusculano project. This is what it looks like on the ground. He had a lot to do with that V-shaped building. The notion being to try to build something new that looked like it might have actually been old. Using materials, forms derived from Italian vernacular architecture, but without really seeing the implications of la macchina and today's security issues. Although these projects clearly helped Muratori, providing with necessary employment, for one thing, they didn't entirely capture his passion for working actively within existing cities. Writing in 1950, contemporaneously with the projects I've just shown you, Muratori emphasized that, quote, "The present task of city planners is the promoting of a unitary concept of the city and of a thorough understanding of a city's life. To achieve this, the prejudices inherent to the science of positivist urbanism must be overcome. A city possesses its own spontaneous life, and it must be studied, understood, and furthered. What is needed is the formation of a class of capable urbanists, critics, and architects who ardently desire a practical solution to the problem and are also endowed with a solid humanist training," unquote. Thus, Muratori began to work toward creating such a class. Hired as a professor of architectural composition in Venice, he spent 2 formative years there, from 1952 to 54, while he also maintained contact with key colleagues in Rome, where from 1954 to his death in 1973, he taught at La Sapienza in Valle Giulia. Muratori's central concern in the 1950s was focused on what he called the working or applied history of the city, this Storia Operante. With this concept, he sought to link design and historical analysis. He thought, as he said, history was today, and there is no gap between today and the past that had led up to it. Muratori and his team of research assistants first turned their attention to Venice, but beginning in 1954, also to Rome, a city with a deeper history and with even stronger connective tissue than Venice. they began examining these cities and their contexts as living organisms. What were their genes? How did they arise and then evolve? What kind of urban DNA did they possess? That last metaphor is my metaphor, not theirs. By 1963, when his study of Rome was published, Muratori and his team of 3 hardworking research assistants summarized graphically and otherwise how and where Rome developed. And I'm sharing with you some of these graphics very briefly. These are graphics that I've been looking at more closely. The American Academy, the amazing American Academy Library, fortunately, has an actual hard copy of this Studio Operante from 1963, which they very kindly let me use in my studio. And these are some of the images of the analysis of his team, looking at the urban evolution of Rome. So here you're looking at this period 1 with the 7 hills. And we're not going to go into great detail about how that developed. But they began with the notion of the territorio and how Rome was first created as an ecological landscape and then a human landscape. Period 2, from the 1st century BCE to the 4th century, the beginning of Christianity in Rome. 5th to the 13th century in period 3. The 14th to the 20th century in period 4. And then, so those were the 4 periods, roughly, that they created in this analysis of Rome's history. And then they compared Rome, the antique Rome, the imperial city of Rome, of the 4th century, with the 20th century Rome, an overlay of the ancient city with 20th century city. They also analyzed the Rome of the 19th century. This a period when, as many of you know, industrialization began to affect many European cities, coming to Rome in the late 19th century, after Italy became a country. They also attempted to document the tessuto urbano of historic Rome's early core in the 1950s and 1960s. Keep in mind that this amazing study was published in 1963, so they were doing this all throughout the 1950s. And so I'm continuing to consult a lot of these graphics and the very difficult words, especially for me. I can struggle through Italian, but it's a struggle to understand all the dimensions of what they were doing. But it's a fascinating, very rich study that I've been using a lot during my work here. When we look at this final image and compare it with the famous Noli plan of Rome, we get a sense not only of how complicated this research endeavor must have been, doing plans of hundreds of buildings' interiors, but also of how difficult the morphological analysis was. One conceptual crutch that aided that analysis and was one of the keys to any city's fabric, organism, evolution, and applied history, according to Muratori, was building type. However, we immediately run into a semantic problem because of connotations associated with that tricky word. Adrian Forti, one of our colleagues in this very room, has written eloquently about type and how historically it related to both use and morphology. Adrian also wrote briefly about Muratori's use of type, so I'm going to embarrass him by quoting what he said right now. The significance that Muratori attached to the types he identified, Adrian said, was that it enabled one to demonstrate in concrete terms. I'm sure there was no pun intended there, Adrian, about concrete. In concrete terms, all the aspects of the process of the city, growth, milieu, class, which historical geographers had previously treated only as abstractions. For Muratori, and now this is not Adrian's quote, for Muratori, type was not a static entity that required description. It was not a style. Instead, it was a dynamic idea, an a priori synthesis that pre-existed before the act of building itself. As one of Muratori's followers expressed it later, type is the product of past and present spontaneous consciousness. If we were to ask a 15th century mason what he was building at the time, if he was building a 3-story row house, he would have no idea of what we were talking about because he simply intends to build a house and not a building type, which we distinguish by comparing it to other types. For Muratori, exploring the nature of especially residential building types and how they evolve through time led him to the conclusion that history was at work in the present. His notion of an applied history provided him with a conceptual armature upon which to hang his evolving notions of what sort of an organism a city was. He also continued to practice architecture beyond inakasa by building not just residential complexes, but also emergenze, or prominent buildings. One of these was a fascinating infill project in Bologna known as the Enpas building, inspired by Gothic architectural elements and structure, but he adapted them using concrete, steel, and brick. He created new kinds of arcades in deferential response to Bologna's famous historic arcades. And in massing and setback, he placed his design relatively modestly within the existing urban context of the northwestern portion of Bologna's Centro Storico. This is an important example, I think, that shows how the master himself manifested his own notion of applied history in an actual building within a living city. I will return soon to that question of application, especially as it relates to conservation of historic buildings in cities. But before I do that, there's that second key point in the Muratorian method, which relates back to the word territorio, or landscape, that I emphasized earlier. It's significant that Muratori and his followers emphasized an integral link between the human-made organism of the city and the human-modified landscape to which the city was connected. And I think it's significant for 3 reasons. First, because of what a few perceptive Italian architects, including the amazing urban planner who was at the forefront of Bologna's urban conservation work in the 1970s, have told me about their serious concerns about what they call urbanizing rural landscapes in Italy, when I've discussed contemporary urbanization in Italy with them. This point has come up often in the limited interviews I've conducted, and frankly, it's not something I was expecting. The second reason this linkage is significant at a larger scale beyond Italy is because of the global context of rampaging urbanization and how sustainable that is or is not in the context of climate change, population growth, cultural dynamics, and other things. This topic, sustainability, is at the forefront of the upcoming UN Habitat Conference in Quito, Ecuador. One astute observer of that intensifying urbanization in China has written a book that sums up the challenge in the book's title, Cities Surround the Countryside. Because of my early engagement with China in the late 80s, when I lived for a year in a very different Shanghai than the one we hear about today, where my son is teaching high school, and because of my decade-long stay in Hong Kong, I've seen firsthand the dramatic effects of that urbanization. But that's a whole other lecture. The third reason the link between the city and its broader landscape is significant is because of how extensively that word landscape is becoming adopted by many in my own field, urban conservation. In 2011, both UNESCO and ICOMOS, a major international conservation organization, adopted the phrase historic urban landscape as a conceptual model for facing the myriad challenges associated with protecting cultural heritage in cities worldwide. UNESCO has stated that its approach, quote, to managing historic urban landscapes is to integrate the goals of urban heritage conservation with those of social and economic development. This method sees urban heritage as a social, cultural, and economic asset for the development of cities. The historic urban landscape approach, sometimes called HUL, moves beyond the preservation of the physical environment and focuses on the entire human environment. Taking its inspiration from the concept of cultural landscape, this HUL approach is currently being promoted worldwide. Well before the HUL idea was being touted, however, another significant global conservation organization, ICROM, located right down the hill in Trastevere, was utilizing approaches partially inspired by Italian practitioners such as Muratori. most notably in its ITUC workshop, ITUC standing for Integrated Territorial and Urban Conservation, begun in the 1990s by Yuka Yokileto, who's sitting right here listening to this lecture. Nicholas Stanley Price, also sitting here, a former director of ICROM, was also very aware of all of that. ICROM's adaptation of Muratori and other methods of urban analysis could easily be yet another lecture, but I'm not going to yield the floor to either Yuka or Nicholas, so you'll have to go elsewhere for that. I'm suggesting that Muratori was being prescient when he emphasized this connection between the city and its wider territorio. And yet when he taught here in Rome during the late 1950s and the tumultuous decade of the 1960s, Muratori was criticized as backward-looking and conservative. Here's a cartoon from that period. Muratori is the man on the left, riding alone on a tricycle. It is important to remember, for example, as we ponder the amazing exhibition about Super Studio that's now at Maxi, that this much more dominant contemporary architectural narrative related to modernism was drowning out the Muratorian message. Muratori's one-time colleague, Ludovico Quaroni, also teaching architectural composition at La Sapienza during the 1950s and 60s, was much more popular and much more sympathetic to the architectural message related to modernist orthodoxy associated with Le Corbusier and the Congress of Modern Architecture. Muratori was mocked as a historicist and traditionalist by popular critics such as Bruno Zevi, Aldo Rossi, and Carlo Aimonino. Eventually, Muratori became ever more brooding, isolated, and philosophical. He wrote, writing long, rambling commentaries about civilization and territory, and creating complex, abstract charts called tabellone that concern typologies ranging from furnishings to the interconnectedness of world civilizations. All of his followers have told me, don't even try to understand the Italian of late Muratorian prose. He died in 1973, never seeing his theories being taken seriously by his peers. However, a few of his students were remarkably loyal to him. Sandro Giannini traveled to Ethiopia and attempted to apply Muratori methods to traditional settlements in the context of Italian colonialist town planning, and I've just begun examining this work. One of Muratori's major research assistants, Gianfranco Caniggia, refined the message of his mentor in several ways, suggesting that basic building, edilizia di base, was the formative matrix for architectural design. Caniggia, who died in 1987, and other Muratori followers began proposing that the only, quote, really innovative way of planning in towns is to interpret them according to history, avoiding extemporaneous solutions linked to unjustified individual interventions, unquote. But this approach clearly continues to run afoul of many architectural practitioners today, whom I don't need to name. That, too, is the subject of an entirely different lecture. During the past 4 months here, I've been seeking out several Muratori followers, in Rome and Florence in particular, but there are others in this circle of Muratori adulation from Cortona, Bari, and elsewhere. And they have generously shared their time as I've interviewed them about the implications of Muratori's methods and ideas. 2 generations later, there is now an international seminar on urban form that has its headquarters here in Italy. A journal, Urban Morphology, has been created. And there have been Muratori-influenced studies conducted in France, Holland, and elsewhere. There was a major conference here in fall 2015, coordinated by professors at Sapienza, one of whom I interviewed soon after I arrived. And he introduced me to 2 colleagues of Caniggia in Florence, who I interviewed twice. The first time after giving me a fascinating study of the southern Tuscan city of Pienza's urban history and how to read that amazing city, a jewel of mid-15th century urban design. By using a Muratori approach, they suggested that after digesting the study, I should visit the World Heritage sites of Valdorcia and Pienza firsthand, which I did, with fresh perspectives. In the past 4 months, I visited several other historic towns on my own, mostly in northern Lazio and southern Tuscany, as I've tried to relate the written work I've been examining about Muratori to actual places. And in these encounters, I've been trying to read these towns and their edilizia di base in a Muratorian manner. Time doesn't permit me to go into great depth about these visits, but they include places, remarkable places, like Pitigliano and Sorano, Abbadia San Salvatore, San Giovanni Valdarno, Monte San Savino, Lucignano, and Poggio Mirteto. I'll be glad to talk to you about those places and those visits anytime, but not now, because this is the end of my first journey into conservation. Journey number 2, which in a way I've already begun by talking about Hull and about related matters, will be shorter. One of the main questions I've been asking regarding the implications of Muratori's work concerning conservation is, after reading the city in a Muratorian manner, how to make decisions about what and how to conserve of the significant historic architecture in any given city. Ultimately, many involved in the conservation of historic architecture have to make tough decisions about what is allowed and what is not. Muratori prided himself on studying applied history, and yet I've been struck by how rarely Muratori himself or his followers have actually applied his methods practically in the context of urban conservation within Italy. In my second conversation with those Florentine architects, which Adrian Forti also graciously participated in, I broached this question with keen interest, mainly because I'm thinking of my own work in Southeast Asia, where, in places like Penang, there's a strong need to be practical rather than academic, where conservation decisions often hinge on economics rather than aesthetics, where I am trying to enlighten practicing architects who possess little conservation sensitivity and give me very little time, unlike captive architecture students who are taking a course for a semester. I sensed that my new architect friends in Florence had never really asked themselves the question I posed to them: how to apply Muratori approaches to conservation in cities. We had a fascinating 2-hour discussion about it, and time prevents me from summarizing it entirely, but here are a couple of highlights. First, they thought that the Muratorian Canadian methodology, perhaps not surprisingly, did serve as a foundation for making conservation decisions. Second, regarding either actual interventions on historic buildings or infill, new architecture within historic environments, they asserted that their methodology could assist in yielding practical design guidelines. And they made some valid points, and yet, I don't know, I wonder. Regarding the universal application of the method as a conceptual foundation for conservation, the Muratorian method seems to presume an understanding of the culture to which the physical architecture relates. Italian lifestyles related to vernacular buildings in Italian cities, for example. Yet in so many contexts where I work in Asia, either where indigenous cultures are living in so-called colonial buildings, or where many different kinds of cultures are living near or amidst each other in the same neighborhoods, this linkage between physical fabric and cultural dynamics is not always so simple or clear-cut. I'm thinking of the excellent example Senam gave last week in her shop talk regarding the descendants of slaves in Accra's Franklin House, living in buildings originally erected by Afro-Brazilian owners. I hope I got that right, Senam. In any case, it reminds me of many situations I've encountered in Malaysia, where Muslims from South India were brought or lured by British colonial masters to live in what are termed 19th century shophouses, or where Chinese historic traders built different kinds of shophouses and infused them with Chinese cultural practices, like the building on the right. You get the idea, or at least we can certainly talk more about this idea later. It's a complex and fascinating idea. Thus, in Malaysia, when we're trying to read the city in order to make decisions about what is culturally significant and why, there's a strong need for what is sometimes called their cultural mapping, whereby we essentially become field anthropologists in order to document how spaces are being used by different ethnic groups in the same urban area. This documentation and understanding of what is culturally significant is critically important too from the standpoint of following a clear, systematic conservation methodology. And this then brings me to a brief explanation of what's called the Burra Charter. The Burra Charter is named after a small town in South Australia, where several heritage professionals met in 1979 to draft a more sensible methodology for practice, they believed, than the Venice Charter of 1964, which had been the world's major set of principles for conservation. But these Australian architects thought the Venice Charter was Eurocentric in its focus on historic monuments and not easily applicable to Australian or many other cultural contexts. In its preamble, it is stated that, quote, the Burra Charter sets a standard of practice for those who provide advice, make decisions about, or undertake works to places of cultural significance, including owners, managers, and custodians, unquote. The Charter takes a values-based approach to conservation, whereby a variety of values, historical values, social values, scientific, religious values, are articulated about a place as one attempts to clarify and write clearly about what is culturally significant about it. Many Australian conservation architects I respect have told me that they do as much as is necessary, but as little as possible, which I think is a great aspiration for conservation practitioners. Which also reminds me of the words, touch the earth lightly, linked to one of the greatest architects, I think, who's practicing today, Pritzker Prize-winning Australian Glenn Murcutt. The Burra Charter essentially proposes a three-step conservation process, whereby one understands significance, and two, uses that understanding to develop one or more policies related to the conservation of that place's significance. And finally, three, manages the place in accordance with that policy or policies. It sounds simple, but it's quite complicated. The Burra Charter is not a universally employed conservation process, but throughout Asia it has often been either adopted or as is or adapted to other cultural contexts as a robust, logical, and practical methodology for conserving a full range of culturally significant places. There is now, for example, both a China Principles, which, in full disclosure, the Getty Conservation Institute collaborated with many Chinese practitioners in elaborating, and a Thailand Principles, both adapted from the Burra Charter. In the courses I've created and coordinated in Malaysia, and there have been 3 of them since 2012, called Urban Conservation Planning in Malaysia, delivered with 2 Malaysian organizations in partnership with my institute and with a team of 8 teachers whom I hire and coordinate with. I too have utilized this methodology as a way to train architects and urban planners who seek a greater understanding of how, why, and where to conserve historic places. I've also utilized this method when training archaeological site managers in the context of other training courses I've coordinated in Laos, People's Democratic Republic, Thailand, and Tunisia. I find it to be the best method I've seen that, when used sensitively, leads to very positive results in both practical and pedagogical ways. I won't go into further detail here about the courses I've managed in Malaysia, except to say that they're intense, they're site-based, exhilarating, and challenging. We use active learning methods, create on-site exercises, and try to convey to practitioners who are sometimes skeptical about conservation that by engaging in this kind of work, one can be both creative and responsive to social needs. As Senam suggested in her talk about Accra, heritage conservation is not all necessarily about gentrification, making kitschy new architecture to mimic the old, or creating tourist spots for rich people. Design and conservation can and should be concerned with meeting social needs as historic places are rehabilitated. That said, though, one of the risks I see in using typological analysis to create design guidelines is that less creative architects might simply mix and match historical design elements in a superficial pastiche, reminiscent of the worst kind of postmodern architecture. I broached this with my Florentine architect friends in our second conversation, and they agreed that this was risky, although they thought there were ways that quality architects could work creatively within the confines of materials and setback that adhering to previous precedents might impose. So to summarize before moving on to my final journey 3, I can see how a Muratorian approach could be linked to the cultural mapping I've been already using, which would be useful. I can also imagine that there might be ways to use a study of building types as something that could aid in drafting design guidelines, although that's more tenuous. And finally, the way that Muratori and other Italian architects I've spoken to seem to see strong connections between the city and the broader landscape is very relevant to the Asian context I'm working with, where the division between nature and culture seems arbitrary, false, and unhelpful. This division, unfortunately, is still embedded in many international principles created largely by Western experts, but now, fortunately, these are increasingly being questioned critically. I continue to ponder how my studies here in Rome can relate to my future training work, and I'd really enjoy hearing ideas from any of you who care to engage in this kind of discussion. So we're nearing the end, and for me, this is new terrain. As I said, I don't really talk about this very often with people outside of my little circle. At the beginning of this talk, I mentioned how one approach I've used in my architectural history research with both Murphy in China and Muratori in Italy has been to examine broader trends through intriguing individuals. And now what I'm about to do is train my sights autobiographically to see the bigger picture very briefly of why I've been drawn so much to cross-cultural issues in architectural history and conservation, why so-called colonial contexts seem to fascinate me so much, how I see direct connections between stratigraphic archaeological investigation and more above-ground architectural analysis within cities, and why I'm uncomfortable with seeing cultural change being restricted to often arbitrarily confined geographical entities, such as Western Europe, the Middle East, or Southeast Asia. Many of my perspectives about these complicated issues stem from the pivotal decade of my 20s. As a 20-year-old, I was studying medieval and early modern European history, with a particular focus on Spain, since I'd been an exchange student to Chile when I was 17, and I wanted to understand Spanish history more deeply. In my senior year at college, I began taking anthropology courses, and I did a major research paper about deserted medieval villages. As I contemplated what I might do as a history major, I decided to write to several of the European archaeologists whose work I'd read from my research paper, asking for a job. Without pay, but with room and board, I was offered a place on the excavation team of Jean-Marie Pézet, a French archaeologist who had been digging since 1964 at Dracy, a Burgundian village deserted in the 14th century. I wound up working with Pézet and his wonderful team for 2 years, 1972 to 1974, off and on, during which time I learned an enormous amount about stratigraphic archaeology and many other things. My French became fluent, and I became very close friends, in particular with 2 French colleagues, a couple. We talked about the collaborative work and travel we'd do in the future. Pézet had begun digging a deserted village near Cefalù in Sicily, and he offered me the chance to work there. But I was lonely and broke and confused about what I wanted to do, so I declined that offer. Many of you might think I was crazy to give up a chance to excavate in a place like Cefalù. And I returned to the United States to work in Maine on a prehistoric dig with an American archaeologist. That was 1974, the summer Nixon resigned. During that fall, when I began volunteering at Harvard's Peabody Museum, the unthinkable happened. I received a letter informing me that my 2 best French friends had drowned while swimming near Cefalù. I was devastated. I began reassessing what I was doing with my life, thinking that I might also perish unexpectedly. Who knows? And somehow, although I've tried to resurrect it, the exact moment eludes me, I began recalling the magical medieval maps, Mappa mundi, that had captivated my attention so much when I was studying medieval history. Circular in shape, often with Jerusalem at their center, the earthly Jerusalem as the pivot with the heavenly one, and with the 3 known continents, known to Europeans at least, of Africa, Europe, and Asia, splayed out to fill the circle. These maps hinted at unknown beasts, demons, and other mysteries as one ventured away from the cradle of Europe. Somehow, in the wake of losing my friends and remaining confused about whether I should continue studying archaeology or do something else, I began to imagine a journey in which the Mappa mundi figured. I had friends who had walked the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, and I considered doing that. But instead, I thought it would be even more interesting, intrigued by the Mappa mundi, to walk to the center of the medieval world, Jerusalem, from a point on its perimeter. It was a pretty crazy idea, but the idea wouldn't let go of me. And so I began to work in a restaurant to earn money, and I became ever more obsessed with the idea of doing this pilgrimage as a way to reflect about my future and find a clear path forward. I was 25 years old. But where should I start on that circle's perimeter? I considered many spots, but one day I learned about the island of Fula, well west of the main island in the Shetland Islands, isolated in the rough North Sea. When I saw images like this and learned that etymologically Fula is related to Thula and Telos, end, I sensed I'd found my point of origin for the journey to the center. I worked hard for over a year to save money, also getting ready in other ways, as the American bicentennial celebrations began intensifying. I was repulsed by that hyper-patriotism, just as the U.S. finally had gotten out of Vietnam. My mother became increasingly worried. Then, a few months before I had decided to leave, in July of 1976, an unexpectedly magical thing happened. I fell in love. Mary came into my life. After wondering whether I should postpone the trip to remain with her or embark on it without her and reunite afterward, one day I spontaneously asked if she'd like to come with me. And she said yes. And so we left together. After flying to Aberdeen and taking a boat to Shetland, we began walking, and we continued, camping out, occasionally staying in hostels, beginning a long honeymoon before we were officially married in 1980, and putting one foot in front of another for over 3 months. During that surreal time, when we began to see the world so differently because we were moving so slowly and falling in love more deeply, we also met a couple of fellow travelers who had recently returned from Asia. They began filling our heads with those mysterious lands beyond Jerusalem, all the way to India and beyond, similar to how that mythical John Mandeville put visions of far-off wonders and demons in the minds of naive believers. We were burning through my saved cash quickly in Europe. It's so much cheaper and more interesting to travel overland from the Mediterranean to India, they said. And we began dreaming of that possibility as we made our way ever eastward towards Jerusalem, working the first winter in a Swiss hotel to save money. Why not travel a diameter instead of just a radius, we reasoned. Time is short, so I can't really spin out our entire odyssey, but let me share some basic outlines because they relate significantly, I think, to my perspectives about history, culture, cities, and conservation. In a real sense, they mapped out the future that I'm now living. We continued making our way by land and sea, but no longer walking, for cost reasons mainly, to Jerusalem. We arrived there in July 1977, approximately 1 year after we'd started. We then found work in Israel in a hotel, and we saved more money so we could continue venturing eastward. In December 1977, we were in places like Istanbul, Bursa, Konya, Erzurum in eastern Turkey. By January, we'd crossed into Iran, Tabriz, Tehran, Isfahan, eventually to Mashhad in the east. Sometime in February 1978, we crossed into Afghanistan. Spent about 2 months in Herat, Kandahar, Kabul, Jalalabad, bin Laden's territory. Passing through the Khyber Pass, reaching Pakistan in March of '78. Peshawar, Rawalpindi, Islamabad, Lahore. We made our way into northern India through Amritsar, Delhi, Agra, Varanasi. By May, we were in Nepal, Kathmandu, of course, and then trekked from Pokhara up through the Annapurna range of mountains to a place called Penang influenced by Tibetan Buddhism. We returned to Kathmandu and discovered that Mary had amoebic dysentery. We returned to northern India and eventually made our way by train to the south and then crossed to recover for her in Sri Lanka. We spent 2 months there in places like Colombo, Kandy, Trincomalee, Polonnaruwa, many wonderful places. But we ran out of money. So we decided we would take our trip back by land to Iran, where it was very easy at that time to find teaching jobs, teaching English. So we made our way by land back from Sri Lanka to Iran, arriving in August 1978. And we found jobs teaching in the Iran-America Society in Shiraz. And we began working in September 1978, just as the Iranian Revolution was beginning to get into full swing. And we were trapped by that revolution in the early winter of 1979 and managed to escape in about a month overland by bus to Istanbul and then Athens and finally Paris. And then eventually, much to the great relief of our parents, we made it back to the United States. That trip exposed me to places and people I never could have imagined. It rekindled my interests in history and art many times over. I realized how much I was drawn to historic architecture and cities, just as I saw a direct connect, just as I was shocked to see so many phenomenal places being destroyed or deteriorating. I saw a direct connection between stratigraphic archaeology below ground and historic architecture and urban spaces above ground. Mary was particularly thrilled by the anthropology of food, markets, and cross-cultural cuisine. Our lives were tied to the road and to each other. As we restitched our lives to the strange United States after this hyper-adventure of getting out of Iran during the revolution, we reflected more seriously about what we would do. Mary opted for nutrition. I plunged into historic preservation and dreamed of finding work internationally, essentially the job that I have now. We both dreamed of having a family, which we did, and a life that would somehow perpetuate the thrills we'd found together by following paths within and across our own Mappa mundi. For Mary, tragically, that life ended 6 years ago. For me, my journey into conservation and into much more, thankfully, continues, with a terrific job at the Getty, confronting many of these challenges that I witnessed during our odyssey. So, grazie mille, all of you, for making this particular journey so memorable, and happy trails to all of you. Thanks. Well, let me take the easy part first, I guess. Muratori almost always talked about territorio. He used that word. Well, that's really hard to define. I mean, I think part of it was an abstract notion, and part of it was very practical. He and his followers very often would try to get a sense of what we, I suppose, would call the ecology of a surrounding around a city. They were very interested in the city, but they wanted to understand how was the city first settled. Was it through a valley? Was it through the ridgeways? Was it? For example, they became very interested in Lazio and Tuscany with the role played by Mount Amiata and the volcanic eruption geologically that had created all these volcanic tufa stone. And they began to look at that as a beginning point, and looking at the way that the land forms had had changed over time and what effect they had on settlement patterns and agriculture and where the rivers lay. And so that was the kind of thing that they focused on when they thought about territorio. He also sometimes called it ambiente. But he never got, I struggle with his language. I didn't realize when I embarked on this just how difficult, I mean, first of all, it's in Italian, which I can deal with to some extent, but I'm not fluent in Italian. So I struggle with it. And when it gets to be really conceptual, especially when he later talked about territorio, it gets to be really difficult to know. My own sense, I mean, you're asking me from how I see it myself. I find these terms to be really difficult to define clearly for myself. I find it very interesting. I had a fascinating talk with Chris the other night about this, that this word landscape seems to be just coming into our world so much. I mean, I've been very interested, for example, that the American Academy of Rome now has this NL Foundation, landscape urbanism, kind of whatever it's called, new fellowship in landscape urbanism. And I think that's another indication of how this word landscape is just being adopted by so many different, by the historic urban landscape and other cultural landscapes. It seems to be a very popular term, but I'm not sure that people are really worrying too much about, at least the people I'm coming in touch with, are not worrying a whole lot about exactly how they're defining that term. So I'm punting on the question. I don't really have a set definition in my mind relative to these other words like countryside. But I think, I think it's fascinating here in Italy that there is many of the people that I'm speaking to, the architects, seem to have a much clearer, holistic sense of the outskirts of the city and its relation, instead of what I find in other parts of the world where they don't think ecologically as much that way. Yep.
A line there, and I'm just wondering, have you, because also almost all the words that you quoted for Muratori are in some way worked back into the text of Giovanni, whose language is very much sort of in the same line. So I'm wondering, do you see Muratori as more of a further development of Giovanni's ideas, or as a departure from them? And what would you say would be the differences between them, other than perhaps just, for lack of a better term, architectural style in terms of the kinds of buildings he made, but in terms of the ideas, do you see them as pretty much in continuity?
I think there is a definite continuity. You're a much better Giovanni expert than I am, but I think that that one of the differences is that Giovanni really got. I mean, in looking at his analyses of the city, he was beginning to make judgments about what could go, what couldn't go, and what could be modified, and so on. And Muratori he didn't seem to be as interested in actual conservation practice. He was much more interested in developing these ideas about reading the city, about the connections between typology and the evolution of the city over time. And he seemed to be departing then from Giovanni in not being particularly interested in, as I mentioned in my talk, in actually getting into the nitty-gritty of, okay, so what do you allow within this historic city and what you don't? And I find that very interesting that he didn't, but the reality is he didn't. So, I mean, he's not a conservation architect. And he became much more, he became obsessed with this idea of reading the city and understanding it. But then the question of, okay, now how do you actually interact with it now that you've understood it? He didn't seem to be as interested in that.
more, and returning to your homeland in the United States, your own homeland has by that point become a foreign country. And so how do these shape-shifting, almost prismatic, subjective relationships take place, do they tie together? Are they in constant tension? On the one hand, should conservation be about the grounded conception of the local, or should it be almost the observation of the local from the point of view of a foreigner? Or should the local have somehow become a foreign place? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation and a very provocative, important question, I think. I think there are a couple of ways I react to it. First of all, the longer I'm involved in conservation practice, especially as someone working in an international organization like the Getty Conservation Institute, I telescope in, I helicopter into places that I probably understand better than a lot of people who helicopter in. But I do feel that sometimes, I'm coming in with certain methods, principles, standards, suggestions about practice that might be useful, following these kinds of that sort of methodology that I showed you. And at the same time, it's so critical to have people who are from that local place, who know that place intimately. And that's one of the reasons in my training work, I deliberately hire a combination of people from the local place and so-called experts in various fields of urban conservation, economists, heritage economists, or someone from the outside who has a particular expertise in law or working with adaptive reuse or something like that. But at the same time, it's so important. You were probably not here last week when Senam gave her talk about Ghana particularly, but to do it without the active engagement of people who truly live there and know it and are living that reality is ultimately delusional, because the results are going to be probably not very long lasting. And so I think it's critically important to, you mentioned that word tension. I think there is a tension there. But, hopefully the goal that I would aspire to is having it be a dynamic tension where things are balanced in a way so that there can be people like me coming from the outside, working with local people who really are there and understand the place and understand the architecture and the spaces and the activities so much better than I do. That's why I find this cultural mapping to be so fascinating, because it gets beyond looking at just outside form and materials and style, and really begins to probe inside the building as a place. But it does require almost anthropological study, much more than architectural study. I hope that's answer to your question.
One last quick question. Ron?
Thanks for the talk, John. I just wanted to ask about the politics of the Muratori analytical approach. It seems like in analyzing a city as either an organism or through typology, you're looking at sort of the conception of a natural system that is self-perpetuating, or a set of sort of timeless forms that have existed for a long time. And so it's in conservation
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that that's part of the reason why I find it difficult to imagine transplanting this typological approach, even if I completely agreed with it here in Italy, which I mean, it's not that I disagree with it. I think it's very interesting and useful, but to transplant it to another cultural context, another set of political, economic, social conditions, requires an adaptation. And as you said, as you said and implied, there's a need to, I think, see those political dimensions and recognize them and understand that. I mean, I think Muratori was very interested in what, and a lot of his followers that I've talked to, they're interested in what they called spontaneous construction. And they thought that, as you said at the beginning, that it was kind of regenerating, and that people didn't even think about what they were, they were just building another house. But of course, there have been these major ruptures in the 20th century and even now in a country like Italy. And that has tremendously affected what people are building and what they're not building. So it's not quite as simple as it might have been in a pre-modern period. And the same is true in so many parts of the world where you might be able to look, I think that an analysis of type allows you to get part of the way in understanding what it is that you're seeing and working with. But if you drink that Kool-Aid completely and just say, oh, I'm just going to be looking at type and typological analysis, I think you're ultimately bound for failure, because you need to modulate that with an understanding of these other dimensions that affect construction and what changes in that place, which come from, these days come from Wall Street and from neoliberal economics, from centers of power around the world, or from local investors or local power interests or mafia interests, or many other factors. So it's much more, as you suggest, it's much more complicated than just that typological analysis.
Okay, we have to go upstairs, but let's give Jeff a hand.
Thank you. Thank you.